This week's lesson, we are going to compare Genesis 1, the story of the creation and the creation of Adam and Eve, and Genesis 6 through 9, the story of Noah's family. Now, you could read Genesis 1 and you could read Genesis 6 through 9, and I think you would probably see the things we're comparing, especially if you did some of the motions that we did several weeks ago when we did the creation story in Genesis 1 in Kids Church when we were all together. But I'm going to compress those, and we're just going to kind of quickly look at this comparison, and then we're going to think maybe about what it might mean for what God is doing or what God does. So let's get a start on it. Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the deep waters. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Genesis 1, verses 9 through 11. Then God said, "Let the waters beneath the sky flow together into one place, so dry ground may appear." And that is what happened. God called the dry ground land and the waters seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land sprout with vegetation, every sort of seed-bearing plant, and trees that grow seed-bearing fruit." Genesis 1, verses 26 through 29. Then God said, "Let us make human beings in our image, to be like us. They will reign over the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, and the livestock, and all the wild animals, and all the small animals that scurry on the ground." You remember that part? So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and govern it. Reign over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, the animals that scurry along the ground." Then God said, "Look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant throughout the earth, and all the fruit trees for your food, and I've given every green plant as food for all the wild animals, the birds in the sky, and the small animals that scurry along the ground." Everything that has life. And that is what happened. Okay, here we go with our comparison. This is Genesis chapter 7. This is verses 17, 18, 21, and 24. For 40 days the floodwaters grew deeper, covering the ground and lifting the boat high above the earth. As the waters rose higher and higher above the ground, the boat floated safely on the surface. All the living things on earth died. Birds, domestic animals, wild animals, small animals that scurry on the ground, and all the people. And the floodwaters covered the earth for 150 days. Genesis 8, verses 1, 4, and 5. God sent a wind to blow, and the floodwaters began to recede. The boat came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. 2.5 months later, as the waters continued to go down, other mountain peaks became visible. In Genesis chapter 8, verse 10, Noah released a dove for a second time from the boat, and it came back to him this time with a fresh olive leaf in its beak. Here's Genesis chapter 8, verses 13 and 14. On the first day of the new year, 10.5 months after the flood began, the floodwaters had almost dried up from the earth. Noah lifted the covering of the boat and saw that the surface of the ground was drying. 2 more months went by, and at last the earth was dry. Chapter 8, verses 15 through 17. Then God said to Noah, "Leave the boat, all of you, you and your wife and all your sons and their wives. Release all the animals, the birds, the livestock, the small animals that scurry on the ground, so they can be fruitful and multiply throughout the earth." Genesis chapter 9, verses 1, 2, and 6 and 7. Then God blessed Noah and his sons and told them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. All the animals of the earth, all the birds of the sky, all the small animals that scurry along the ground, and all the fish in the sea will look on you with fear and terror. I have placed them in your power, for God made human beings in his image. Now be fruitful and multiply and repopulate the earth." All right, there we have our reading from Genesis 1, Adam and Eve's story, and our reading from Genesis 6 through 9, the story of Noah's family. And I'll bet you saw the comparisons pretty easily, but we'll talk about them some anyway. In Genesis 1, God's creation is described in terms of moving what is in chaos into meaningful order. God took what was and made it good. That's the way the story is told in Genesis 1. The chaos is represented by waters. They're a picture of chaos. God's Spirit hovered over these chaotic waters and sculpted it into a good order, reflecting God's own intent, his own purposes. In a way, it reflected God. In Genesis 7, Noah's story, God separated the land from the waters so that humanity would have a place to live again. It's pretty similar, isn't it? In Genesis 1, it's God's wind that it seems was ready to bring order and goodness. In Genesis 8, it's God's wind that causes the dry land to appear so that Noah and his family can go back out into the world and all the animals. The word for wind in Hebrew and Greek, ruach and pneuma, actually can be translated in English into more than one word. It can be wind, it can be breath, or it can be spirit. When we talked about Genesis 1 several weeks ago, when we talked about creation, we had some signs for it, and we had how God created, and we had it blowing into wadded up clay, because that's how God created. He blew his breath into humanity. God created humanity in his own image, which is like a signet ring pushed into clay in his own image. Male and female, he created them. Those were our signs for that. If you remember as well, our sign for rain was not a crown, and it was not a whip. It was to rain, to take care of little chicks, to care for, was our picture of how God created human beings to reign. So as we go on in Genesis 8, in Noah's story, he sends out that dove that returns with a branch. And that marks the restoration of vegetation in the world. The dove could finally find a place where plants were able to thrive again. And animal life and humanity will follow in filling the world. Plants, animals, and humanity. Even the way the animals are listed, wild animals and livestock and small animals that scurry on the ground. That is repeated multiple times in Genesis 6 through 9. That was our favorite part when we used our motions in the lesson several weeks ago, wasn't it? God also places the rest of creation under the governance of humanity, and that's related to the image of God. It's interesting, isn't it? The events of Noah's family seem to represent the events of God's creation in Genesis 1. It seems that God's already begun to bring a new creation out of the chaos of humanity's corruption, like we talked about last week. God's already begun to bring a new creation out of the chaos of humanity's corruption. Corruption when we're not what we were supposed to be in the first place. The image of God that we were created in. Now this new creation resets humanity to be God's image in the world, governing over God's creation as God's agents. We have a creative God, and we have a God that makes things good. We have a story of creation out of chaos in Genesis 1, the story of Adam and Eve. We have already in Genesis 6 through 8, in the story of Noah's family, a story of new creation, where God creates something new, gives Noah and his family a new opportunity out of the corruption, chaotic corruption, that humanity had produced in the world. And again, he sends them out, and I think this might be important here, to govern over the rest of creation in his image. He sends them out with blessing to govern over the rest of creation in his image. That's important to this idea of how humanity, you and me, our families, our church, our city, everyone, is supposed to represent God, to show what God is like as we do things in the world. Later on in the Bible, in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verses 21 through 22, we find an interesting statement about Jesus. There, Paul writes, "So you see, just as death came into the world through a man, now the resurrection from the dead has begun through another man. Just as everyone dies because we belong to Adam, everyone who belongs to Christ will be given new life." It seems like we've got a story going on where human beings bring corruption, chaos even, and death. And God does something new to bring new life, new creation, a new possibility of being who we were supposed to be. Sometimes we talk about Jesus as the new Adam. He was the kind of person that Adam was supposed to be in the first place. And the Bible also tells us that we're supposed to be like Jesus. Lots of interesting things to think about in this week's lesson.